The dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul. Your unconscious knows who is lying to you, even when that person is yourself. This isn't mystical intuition or supernatural insight. It's the natural function of your psychological system that registers information beneath the threshold of conscious awareness, perceiving patterns, inconsistencies, and subtle signals that your conscious mind either misses entirely or actively refuses to acknowledge. Tonight, we continue our exploration of Jung's revolutionary psychology by examining one of his most practical, yet often overlooked insights: the compensatory function of the unconscious and its expression through dreams. Building on our previous discussions of the shadow, projection, the curse of consciousness, the anima and animus, prophetic dreams, the inflated ego, collective psychology, happiness-seeking, and spiritual experience, we now turn to the unconscious as an internal warning system that can protect you from both external deception and internal self-delusion. What you'll discover may fundamentally change how you relate to your dreams and other unconscious communications. And by the end, you'll understand why Jung believed that those who develop genuine relationship with their unconscious gain a form of psychological immunity against manipulation and deception that others lack. An insight that has never been more relevant than in our current era of sophisticated misinformation and psychological manipulation. The compensatory function, your psychological balance system. To understand how the unconscious operates as a warning system, we must first grasp what Jung called its compensatory function, the natural tendency of the psyche to balance one-sided conscious attitudes through unconscious counterbalancing. Unlike Freud, who saw the unconscious primarily as a repository of repressed desires and painful memories, Jung recognized it as an intelligent system that actively responds to the conscious mind's limitations, blind spots, and distortions. The unconscious doesn't just store what consciousness rejects, it actively works to maintain psychological equilibrium by providing perspectives, information, and reactions that balance conscious one-sidedness. As Jung wrote in The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, the unconscious processes stand in a compensatory relation to the conscious mind. I expressly use the word compensatory and not the word contrary because conscious and unconscious are not necessarily in opposition to one another, but complement one another to form a totality, which is the self. This compensatory function operates continuously, not just during sleep. Throughout waking life, your unconscious registers information that your conscious mind either fails to notice or actively filters out because it contradicts your preferred beliefs, desires, or self-image. This information doesn't disappear. It accumulates in the unconscious, creating pressure that eventually finds expression through dreams, slips of the tongue, sudden intuitions, or synchronicities. The more one-sided or distorted your conscious position becomes, the more powerfully the unconscious pushes toward correction. As Jung noted in Dreams, the general function of dreams is to try to restore our psychological balance by producing dream material that reestablishes, in a subtle way, the total psychic equilibrium. This balancing act becomes particularly important when your conscious mind is engaged in self-deception or when others are attempting to manipulate you. In these situations, your conscious defenses may actively participate in maintaining illusions, but your unconscious continues to register contradictory information, creating a compensatory response that manifests most clearly through dreams. Consider Maria, who had convinced herself she was in love with a charismatic colleague despite numerous warning signs about his character. Her conscious mind rationalized his inconsistent behavior, ignored red flags, and maintained an idealized image of both him and their potential relationship. But her dreams told a different story, repeatedly depicting him as dangerous, disguised, or deceptive in various symbolic forms. As a wolf in sheep's clothing, as a house with a beautiful facade but rotting foundation, as a gift package containing something dead or decayed. These dreams weren't expressing arbitrary fears or random imagery. They were communicating compensatory information that her conscious mind refused to acknowledge. The unconscious registering of subtle cues about dishonesty, manipulation, and incongruence that her waking awareness either missed or actively suppressed to maintain her preferred narrative. Similarly, Robert entered a business partnership that seemed ideal on paper and aligned perfectly with his conscious goals. But almost immediately, he began having dreams of being led into traps, of signing contracts written in disappearing ink, and of building structures on unstable ground. These dreams emerged not from arbitrary anxiety, but from his unconscious processing of subtle inconsistencies in his partner's behavior and statements. Information his conscious excitement had overlooked, but his unconscious had carefully registered. This compensatory function operates not just regarding external relationships, but also concerning our own self-deceptions. When we maintain consciously idealized self-images that contradict our actual motivations or behaviors, the unconscious produces compensatory dreams that reveal these contradictions, often in uncomfortably clear symbolic language. As Jung wrote in Psychology and Religion, dreams may sometimes announce certain situations long before they actually happen. This is not necessarily a miracle or a form of precognition. Many crises in our lives have a long, unconscious history. We move toward them step by step, unaware of the dangers that are accumulating. But what we consciously fail to see is frequently perceived by our unconscious, which can pass the information on through dreams. In our next section, we'll explore how dreams specifically function as warning systems and why Jung considered dream interpretation essential for psychological protection. But first, consider this question. Have you experienced dreams that seem to warn you about situations your conscious mind was misperceiving? What happened when you either heeded or ignored these unconscious communications? Dream warnings. How your unconscious communicates danger. Dreams represent the most direct and consistent channel through which the unconscious delivers its compensatory warnings. Unlike waking intuitions, which can be easily dismissed or rationalized, dreams communicate through vivid imagery, emotional intensity, and symbolic narratives that bypass conscious defenses, delivering their messages whether we welcome them or not. Jung identified several specific patterns that indicate when dreams are functioning primarily as warning systems. First, warning dreams typically feature heightened emotional intensity, particularly anxiety, fear, disgust, or disorientation. These emotions aren't random psychological noise, but appropriate responses to the unconscious perception of threat or deception. The stronger the emotional charge, the more urgent the unconscious warning. Second, these dreams often use specific symbolic patterns to represent different types of deception or danger. Common examples include masks, disguises, or shape-shifting figures, representing hidden agendas or false personas, unstable structures, weak foundations, or collapsing buildings, symbolizing relationships or situations built on falsehoods, hidden predators, parasites, or invasive entities, depicting exploitation or manipulation, contaminated food or hidden poison, representing toxic influences being internalized unconsciously, being led into traps or maze-like structures with no exit, symbolizing manipulation or entrapment. Vehicles without functioning controls or driven by unknown figures, representing loss of autonomy or being driven by others' agendas. Third, warning dreams frequently feature what Jung called shadow figures, characters who embody disowned aspects of ourselves. These figures often appear as threatening or destructive when they represent aspects of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge, including our own capacity for deception, manipulation, or self-delusion. As Jung wrote in Man and His Symbols, the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. When we're engaging in self-deception, shadow figures in dreams often mirror our own unacknowledged behaviors, showing us through projection what we refuse to see directly. If we're deceiving ourselves about our true motivations, dream figures may appear engaging in similar deception. If we're manipulating others while maintaining a conscious self-image of honesty, dream characters may attempt to manipulate us. Fourth, warning dreams commonly use spatial metaphors to communicate psychological distance from truth, placing us underground, in foggy environments, in mazes, or in settings where visibility is limited. These spatial representations aren't arbitrary, but symbolize our relationship to consciousness and clarity. What makes these warning dreams particularly valuable is their ability to communicate information we registered unconsciously but haven't consciously processed. Research on nonverbal communication indicates that humans continuously perceive subtle facial expressions, voice tone fluctuations, micro-expressions, and behavioral inconsistencies that indicate deception. But this information often remains beneath the threshold of conscious recognition. Similarly, when engaging in self-deception, we typically exhibit internal contradictions between our conscious narratives and our actual feelings, behaviors, or motivations. These contradictions create psychological tension that the unconscious registers and communicates through dreams, even when our conscious mind actively maintains the deception. Consider James, who consulted Jung after experiencing recurring nightmares of being chased by a bull that could speak with a human voice. Through exploration, Jung helped him recognize that the bull represented his own suppressed anger and capacity for aggression, which he consciously denied while unconsciously expressing it in passive-aggressive ways that damaged his relationships. The dream was warning him about his own self-deception, his refusal to acknowledge his anger directly while allowing it to charge through his life destructively. Or consider Sarah, who repeatedly dreamed of discovering hidden rooms in her house filled with neglected dying plants. These dreams emerged during a period when she maintained a conscious narrative of thriving in her career while unconsciously recognizing that her work had become empty and meaningless. The dreams communicated this compensatory truth, showing her the neglected aspects of her inner life that her conscious success narrative refused to acknowledge. As Jung noted in The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, the unconscious is the unwritten history of mankind from time immemorial, a living remnant of archaic times when mythic thinking predominated. It functions apparently by instinct, but on closer inspection, we find that it is not only driven by instinct, but possesses a certain prospective function, giving hints and intimations about future developments. In our next section, we'll explore how developing relationship with these dream warnings creates psychological immunity against both external deception and self-delusion. But first, consider this question. What recurring symbols or themes have appeared in your own dreams that might represent the compensatory function in action? How might these symbols be communicating information that your conscious mind has overlooked or actively denied? Dream literacy, learning the language of your unconscious. If dreams function as an internal warning system, why do so many people fail to benefit from these unconscious communications? Jung identified several barriers that prevent effective reception of dream warnings, along with specific approaches that develop what we might call dream literacy, the capacity to understand and integrate unconscious communications. The first barrier is simple ignorance, the cultural dismissal of dreams as meaningless neural activity or arbitrary psychological noise. This dismissal creates what Jung called anthropological pessimism, the assumption that human psychological functioning is fundamentally chaotic rather than organized toward meaning and wholeness. When we assume dreams have no coherent communicative function, we never develop the attention necessary to perceive their patterns. As Jung wrote in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, dreams are impartial, spontaneous products of the unconscious psyche, outside the control of the will. They are pure nature. They show us the unvarnished, natural truth, and are therefore fitted, as nothing else is, to give us back an attitude that accords with our basic human nature when our consciousness has strayed too far from its foundations and run into an impasse. The second barrier is literal interpretation, the attempt to understand dreams at the object level rather than the symbolic level. Dreams communicate through symbolic imagery that requires decoding, not direct translation. The woman who dreams of a snake isn't necessarily dreaming about an actual reptile, but about what snakes symbolize in her personal and collective psychological context, which might range from hidden danger to transformation and renewal, depending on the dream's specific imagery and emotional tone. The third barrier is projective interpretation, imposing external systems of meaning onto dreams rather than allowing them to communicate their specific message. Whether through predetermined dream dictionaries, rigid Freudian sexual interpretations, or New Age oversimplifications, projective approaches drown out the dream's actual communication with preconceived interpretations. To develop genuine dream literacy, Jung proposed several specific approaches. First, maintain a dream journal, recording dreams immediately upon waking, before they fade from memory or become distorted by conscious elaboration. This practice establishes direct relationship with the unconscious, signaling that its communications are valued and creating a record that reveals patterns over time. Second, practice what Jung called amplification, exploring associations with dream symbols at both personal and collective levels. This involves asking questions like, what does this symbol mean to me personally? What collective or archetypal meanings might it carry? How does it appear in cultural mythology, art, or literature? This amplification process doesn't impose meaning, but expands the context for understanding. If you dream of a lion, you might explore your personal associations with lions, how lions appear in cultural contexts from Christian symbolism, where the lion represents both Christ and the devil in different contexts, to African mythology, where lions often represent royal power, and how these collective associations might interact with your personal experience. Third, pay particular attention to dreams that generate strong emotional responses or that recur with variations over time. These emotional and repetitive patterns typically indicate increased compensatory pressure from the unconscious, signals that are especially important for psychological balance. Fourth, distinguish between different types of dreams, recognizing that not all dreams serve the same psychological function. Jung identified several categories, including compensatory dreams, balancing conscious one-sidedness, anticipatory dreams, preparing for upcoming psychological challenges, archetypal dreams, connecting personal experience to collective patterns, and what he called big dreams, major transformative communications from the unconscious that often mark life transitions. Fifth, develop what Jung called active imagination, a waking practice of engaging directly with dream imagery through dialogue, artistic expression, or embodied exploration. This practice extends dream communication beyond sleep into conscious relationship with unconscious content, strengthening the bridge between conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche. As Jung wrote in The Practice of Psychotherapy, the patient must learn how to give the dream his careful attention, since dreams translate unconscious images through symbols into a language that he can understand with a little help. By interpreting dreams, he can begin to make contact with the unconscious processes and bring their messages into his conscious life. This dream literacy doesn't develop overnight. Like learning any language, it requires consistent practice, attention to patterns, and gradual accumulation of vocabulary and grammar. But Jung observed that even modest development of this capacity creates significant psychological protection, allowing individuals to register both external deception and internal self-delusion before these patterns create serious harm. In our next section, we'll explore how this dream literacy creates what Jung called psychological immunity, protection against manipulation and deception that operates at both individual and collective levels. But first, consider this question. What practices might help you develop greater dream literacy in your own life? How might more conscious relationship with your dreams enhance your capacity to recognize truth from both external sources and within yourself? Psychological immunity, protection against deception and manipulation. Jung's most powerful insight about dream warnings wasn't just that they exist, but that developing relationship with them creates a form of psychological immunity, protection against both external manipulation and internal self-deception that functions even when we're not consciously analyzing dreams. This immunity develops through what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to integrate conscious and unconscious perspectives into a more comprehensive awareness that transcends the limitations of either realm alone. As this integration deepens, the communication between conscious and unconscious becomes more fluid, with unconscious perceptions increasingly available to conscious awareness, rather than emerging only through dreams or other indirect channels. As Jung wrote in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, the unconscious is not a demonical monster, but a natural entity, which, as far as moral sense, aesthetic taste, and intellectual judgment go, is completely neutral. It only becomes dangerous when our conscious attitude to it is hopelessly wrong. To the degree that we repress it, its danger increases. This increased communication creates several specific forms of psychological protection. First, it develops what contemporary psychologists call embodied cognition, the capacity to register information through physical and emotional responses, rather than just intellectual analysis. People with developed dream relationships often report gut feelings or bodily responses to deception that precede conscious recognition, not as supernatural intuition, but as unconscious pattern recognition manifesting through somatic awareness. Consider Margaret, who developed consistent dream work practice over several years. She described how this practice gradually enhanced her waking discernment. I started noticing physical responses to dishonesty before my mind caught up, a tightening in my stomach, a subtle tension headache, or a sensation of heaviness. These feelings would arise during conversations where someone was presenting a false narrative or manipulating information. I'd feel it in my body first, then recognize the pattern intellectually. It was like my unconscious was communicating through physical sensation rather than waiting for dreams. Second, psychological immunity creates increased awareness of projection, the unconscious attribution of disowned psychological content onto others. Since much deception operates through inviting and manipulating projections. This awareness significantly reduces vulnerability to manipulation. When we project unconscious content onto others, we relate not to them as they actually are, but to our projected material. This creates blind spots that manipulators can exploit, encouraging positive projections during manipulation, love bombing, idealization, or flattery, and later triggering negative projections to maintain control, inducing shame, fear, or unworthiness. Dream work systematically illuminates these projections through symbolic representation, allowing their gradual integration and reducing their unconscious influence. As projections diminish, we see others more clearly rather than through the distorting lens of unconscious material, making manipulation significantly more difficult. Third, psychological immunity develops what Jung called symbolic consciousness, the capacity to perceive the symbolic dimensions of everyday experience rather than only their literal aspects. This symbolic awareness helps identify patterns of manipulation that operate beneath surface content. Manipulative communication often contains symbolic inconsistencies, incongruence between verbal content and nonverbal signals, between stated intentions and actual behaviors, or between claimed values and demonstrated priorities. Symbolic consciousness registers these inconsistencies even when conscious attention focuses on surface content, creating a sense of wrongness or discord that warns of potential deception. Fourth, dream work gradually integrates shadow material, those disowned aspects of ourselves that create particular vulnerability to manipulation. When we refuse to acknowledge certain qualities in ourselves, our capacity for selfishness, cruelty, dishonesty, or exploitation, we become especially vulnerable to manipulation through these disowned elements. A person who cannot acknowledge their own selfish impulses becomes easy to manipulate through appeals to selflessness that actually exploit them. Someone who denies their own capacity for cruelty may be unable to recognize cruelty in others, particularly when it's disguised as care or protection. The shadow work facilitated through dream analysis progressively reduces these blind spots, closing doors that manipulators might otherwise use to gain psychological entry. As Jung noted in The Undiscovered Self, there can be no transforming of darkness into light and of apathy into movement without emotion. Dreams provide precisely the emotional engagement with unconscious content that facilitates this transformation, reducing vulnerability to manipulation through increased psychological wholeness. Finally, psychological immunity creates resistance to collective deception, those social narratives, ideologies, or movements that exploit collective unconscious content to manipulate groups rather than just individuals. Jung was particularly concerned with this collective dimension, having witnessed how totalitarian systems manipulated mass psychology through archetypal narratives and shadow projections. Individuals with developed dream relationships maintain psychological individuation even amid collective pressure. The capacity to distinguish personal truth from group narratives, especially when those narratives trigger unconscious archetypal patterns to bypass rational evaluation. This doesn't create immunity to all social influence, but it establishes inner reference points that help maintain orientation amid deliberate manipulation of collective psychology. As Jung wrote in the collected works, the vast majority of people are quite unconscious of how completely they are manipulated by their collective identity. Modern man thinks he is entirely independent and free to make up his mind, but he is, in fact, at the mercy of his cultural prejudices, his complexes, and the archetypes in his unconscious. This insight has never been more relevant than in our current era of sophisticated psychological manipulation through digital media, political polarization, and algorithmic curation of information. Jung's perspective suggests that developing relationship with unconscious communication through dreams creates not just personal psychological balance, but essential protection against increasingly sophisticated manipulation of collective psychology. The integrated warning system, dreams in everyday life. We began with a provocative statement. Your unconscious knows who is lying to you, even when that person is yourself. We've explored Jung's understanding of the compensatory function of the unconscious, how dreams specifically operate as warning systems, approaches to developing dream literacy, and how this creates psychological immunity against deception and manipulation. Now, we arrive at his most practical insight, how this understanding transforms our relationship with unconscious communication in everyday life. Jung's ultimate vision wasn't occasional interpretation of specific dreams, but the development of ongoing dialogue between conscious and unconscious dimensions of the psyche, what he called the process of individuation. This dialogue gradually integrates the warning system function into daily awareness, creating continuous feedback between conscious perception and unconscious processing, rather than separate channels of information. As Jung wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, the unconscious helps by communicating things to us or making figurative allusions. It has other ways, too, of informing us of things which, by all logic, we could not possibly know. Consider synchronistic phenomena, premonitions, and dreams that come true. This integrated warning system manifests in several practical ways that enhance psychological discernment. First, it creates what Jung called active imagination in waking life, the capacity to engage consciously with unconscious content as it emerges, rather than either being possessed by it or repressing it. This skill allows conscious processing of unconscious warnings when they first appear as vague discomfort or subtle intuition, rather than waiting for them to intensify into dream communications or psychological symptoms. Second, it develops heightened attention to synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that Jung believed represented another channel of unconscious communication. These synchronicities often provide external confirmation of internal warnings, creating multiple information sources that collectively indicate potential deception or self-delusion. Third, it establishes what contemporary psychologists call dual process awareness, conscious recognition of both rational analysis and intuitive pattern recognition as valid information sources. Rather than privileging either logic or intuition exclusively, this integrated approach creates comprehensive discernment that utilizes multiple psychological capacities simultaneously. Fourth, it fosters what Jung called psychological mindedness, the habit of asking not just what is happening, but what does this mean psychologically? This perspective identifies the psychological patterns behind surface events, recognizing manipulation strategies, unconscious motivations, and systemic deceptions that might otherwise remain invisible. Finally, it develops genuine humility about our capacity for self-deception, recognition that our conscious narratives often serve psychological purposes beyond factual accuracy. This humility creates openness to unconscious correction rather than defensive maintenance of preferred self-concepts, allowing integration of uncomfortable truths rather than their repression or rationalization. Consider Thomas, a business executive who developed consistent dream work practice after discovering his company had been engaged in legally questionable accounting practices he had unconsciously ignored despite multiple warning signs. Through this practice, he gradually developed what he described as an internal warning system that operates constantly. I've learned to notice when my body registers unease during presentations or negotiations, subtle signals that contradict the surface narrative. I become aware of my own tendencies toward convenient self-deception when certain decisions would benefit me financially but conflict with deeper values. Most importantly, I've developed respect for the unconscious as a partner in decision-making rather than an opponent to be overcome or ignored. Recently, I was considering a partnership that looked perfect on paper and aligned with all my conscious goals. But I noticed subtle unease arising whenever specific financial projections were discussed. Nothing I could rationally justify, just persistent discomfort. Instead of dismissing this as irrational anxiety, I paused the process to investigate more thoroughly. This investigation revealed accounting inconsistencies that would have created significant problems later. My unconscious had registered patterns my conscious analysis missed, saving me from a partnership that looked ideal but contained hidden deception. This integrated relationship with unconscious warning signals doesn't create perfect protection against all deception. No psychological system can provide absolute immunity in a complex human landscape, but it establishes significantly enhanced discernment that operates continuously rather than only during periodic dream analysis, creating what Jung considered an essential foundation for psychological autonomy in both individual and collective contexts. As you reflect on tonight's exploration of Jung's perspective on the unconscious as warning system, consider this question: how might develop a more conscious relationship with your dreams and other unconscious communications enhance your capacity to recognize both external deception and internal self-delusion? What patterns of unconscious warning might already be operating in your life, awaiting more conscious recognition and integration? Remember Jung's core insight: those who understand their dreams who develop genuine dialogue with their unconscious rather than either repressing it or being possessed by it, develop psychological immunity against both manipulation and self-deception. This immunity doesn't operate through supernatural intuition or mystical insight, but through the natural integration of conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche into a more complete awareness that perceives what either dimension alone might miss. In a world of increasingly sophisticated psychological manipulation, from targeted marketing algorithms to political disinformation campaigns, from personal relationships to collective movements, this capacity for integrated discernment has never been more essential, not just for individual psychological well-being, but for maintaining the very possibility of authentic truth-seeking in both personal and collective dimensions of human existence. The unconscious knows who is lying to you, even when that person is yourself. The question is, are you listening?